Hello everybody, thanks for joining me in another digital art lesson. This week I'm very excited to talk about artist Kehinde Wiley. We're going to look at some of his beautiful portraits. We're going to learn a little bit about the artist himself, and then we are going to make our own portrait in the style of Kehinde Wiley. Let's talk about what we need for today's project. Okay, so for today's lesson, you will need your sketchbooks or a piece of paper. You're gonna need a pencil to sketch out your beautiful ideas. And then when you're done sketching and outlining, you can use whatever you would like to color today. So let's talk about the artist for a little bit before we get started on today's lesson. So Kehinde Wiley was born in 1977 in Los Angeles, which is not too far from us here in San Francisco. And by the time he was about 11 years old, he already knew that he wanted to be an artist. So he studied, and he actually traveled to Russia for a little bit, and that's where he fell in love with painting portraits. And his portraits have very busy, energetic, almost consuming backgrounds where they take over the subject matter. They overlap onto the subject's clothes, and it's often like a battle between the subject and the background. Which one has more emphasis and which one is more important in the portrait? So another thing about his portraits is that they are very large. They're about 8 feet tall for the most part. They're very big and they take up a big portion of the wall when you see them in the art gallery. So you'll notice that there's very specific poses in some of his artwork, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. And I want you to keep that in your mind when we're looking at them. So he loved painting pictures of people, and he continued to do that, and he continued to use those very beautiful, colorful backgrounds that almost took over the subject, right? And then he got asked to paint a portrait by someone who was very famous. And it actually ties into this week because we got a new president of the United States. Well, when Barack Obama was president of the United States, Kehinde Wiley painted a portrait of him. So every time we get a new president of the United States, they get a choice of which artist they would like to paint their presidential portrait. And Obama chose Kehinde Wiley to paint his presidential portrait. And look at all of the colors in the background, how it really starts overlapping on his feet here. And I love all of the flowers, and each flower has a meaning to Obama's life. So some of those flowers are from Kenya, where his father was from. Some of the flowers are from Hawaii, where he spent a lot of time, in Arizona. So this background tells a story about Obama's life as well. So a couple other things about this painting is, again, yes, it is about 8 feet tall, okay? And it took Kehinde about 2 years to finish the painting. So he spent a lot of time on this painting. And can you imagine the amount of pressure that the President of the United States asked you to paint a portrait of him? That is a lot of pressure. But Obama loved the portrait, and it had a lot of meaning in our country and the whole world because President Barack Obama was the first African-American president, and Kehinde Wiley was the first African-American to paint a presidential portrait. So it meant a lot to Obama. It also meant a lot to Kehinde Wiley and everyone around the whole world. So I really wanted to share this beautiful presidential portrait and talk about its meaning a little bit. So I wanted to talk about those poses that I mentioned earlier. This man's hands are kind of just held up like this, and he got that from old European Renaissance artwork. Now look at this painting, how this hand is perfectly posed, and there is an object in this person's hand, and the head is tilted and turned just slightly. So all of these things are really important, especially in old, again, Renaissance paintings. Now, Kehinde Wiley studied these old Renaissance paintings because he went to San Francisco Art Institute, where he got his Bachelor's of Fine Arts, and then he went and studied more at Yale University, and he got his Master's of Fine Arts. So he studied these old Renaissance paintings and he loved the poses, and he then recreated them with a different subject. That same pose, right? And this very colorful background, again, taking over. And I love this idea of recreating these old poses. Here's another one. This one is an old painting of Napoleon kind of leading his horse over the Alps here. And there's another painting that Kehinde Wiley did of that same pose. And he again chose to change the subject and put in that very colorful background. Okay, everyone, so now it's time to take all those things that we learned and all those things that inspired us to create our own Kehinde Wiley portrait. So here is a watercolor painting that I did. It's a self-portrait. You don't have to do a self-portrait if you don't want to. You could do a portrait of somebody else, or you could do a portrait of yourself. So the other thing is, think about the pose that you would like to do in your painting or your drawing. Do you want to do an old Renaissance pose? Whoops, like this. Or do you want to do just any old pose that you would like to? It's up to you. Make sure your background is very colorful, very busy, and make sure that it overlaps onto your subject. If you did want to do one of those old Renaissance poses, I did an example of that as well on my whiteboard. So you can pick an old pose from the Renaissance era, maybe something like this, and you can change the objects in your hands if you want to make it more about you. So I put a paintbrush in my hand to show that I like art. I also changed the clothes. That is another big thing that Kehinde Wiley did, is he always made his portraits look like that person, their style, what they wore, and that was a big part of his artwork. So again, I have a very busy background. I have some big flowers, very natural background. I hope you all enjoyed learning about artist Kehinde Wiley, and I can't wait to see some of your portraits. Have fun. See you next week.